Oh, on behalf of the family of faith here at Pleasant Hill Baptist Church, I want to welcome those who are visiting with us tonight via YouTube or Facebook. Tonight we are continuing our series of sermons of questions from the dark. We've been in some dark places over the last few weeks. Would you agree with that? Now, this means yes. This means no. We've been to some dark places. When you start talking about suicide and you start talking about death, and these are just issues, we don't bring up all the time in church, especially suicide. When was the last time you heard a sermon preached on suicide? And these are issues the church has to talk about, because if we're not going to talk about it, then your children and you are going to learn from the world, and you're going to get an incorrect response. Just that simple, because we are in this world, but we're not of this world. So when I was thinking about, what do you do next? And I thought, well, we could do this subject, we could do that subject. I could just get them to submit what they want to hear. And then I thought, we might want to get out of the darkness. So tonight, we're talking about questions about light out of the darkness. Because no matter how dark the night, the darkness can never comprehend the light. I don't know if y'all read this story. Thought it was kind of funny. Not funny, ha-ha, but just unusual. Most of y'all have heard of Aaron Rodgers, right? Aaron Rodgers is all-pro quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. Going to be making $40 million next year. That's pretty much guaranteed. And he's trying to decide what he wants to do. Now, if I remember correctly, I think that Aaron Rodgers was raised in a Christian home. But he has renounced his faith completely. And he is one weird dude. He's just kind of strange. He's different. When the season was over, these were his options. He could either retire, he could stay with the Green Bay Packers, or he could demand a trade. And they asked him, they said, what do you think you're going to do? And he responded by saying, I'm going on a darkness retreat. I'm going to be in isolation and darkness for 4 days to try to figure out what I'm going to do. Well, that retreat lasted 2 days. And when he came out of the darkness, he didn't have an answer. And the reason is you never find the answer in the darkness. You always find the answer in the light. Light brings about security. Light brings about information. You can distinguish one object from the next in the light, but it's difficult to do in the dark. And our world is covered with darkness, but that doesn't mean that God is not on his throne. He is still well and alive. And he is still working everything out for the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So tonight, let's take our Bibles and let's open them up to Psalm 30. Psalm 30, 1 through 5. And the psalmist says this, I will exalt you, O Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. O Lord my God, I called to you for help, and you healed me. O Lord, you brought me up from the grave. You spared me from going down into the pit. Sing to the Lord, you saints of his. Praise his holy name. For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may remain for a night, but I love this. But rejoicing comes in the morning. There's rejoicing in the light. weeping in the darkness. Now let's look at John 1, 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He was with God in the beginning. And through Him all things were made, and without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness cannot comprehend it. Underline that passage. Underline that verse. Light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot understand it. Mark 16, 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, brought spices so that they may go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" Pretty good question to ask. You have these ladies that are heading over there. The tomb is being guarded by a Roman soldier. The stone that rolls in front of the tomb is extremely heavy, and they're already thinking about how are they going to get this done. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? Go tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anybody because they were afraid. That's interesting, isn't it? They didn't say anything to anybody because they were afraid. Do y'all remember the old Reader's Digest? Did y'all subscribe to Reader's Digest? I can remember going to my great aunt's home. She not only subscribed to Reader's Digest, she had the hard copies that had several volumes over together. And when she passed away, we were throwing Reader's Digest away right and left. But Clarence Hall was the senior editor for Reader's Digest for many, many years. And he tells the story of going to the Holy Land for the very first time. And I'm telling y'all, this thing is going to happen. And if you can go, go. If you are thinking about it, go. You may not ever have this opportunity again. But he was so excited because the highlight of the trip, if you can imagine this, was an Easter sunrise service at the Garden Tomb. Boy, does it get any more special than that? I mean, he was unable to sleep. Have you ever had that excitement where you're just shaking in the bed? Clarence Hall said, that's how I felt, like a child on the night before Christmas. He said, I just couldn't contain myself. So he went down into the hotel lobby where he met his guide, Abdul. And he was so excited, he said this to Abdul. He said, the night is never going to end. And Abdul responded by saying, patience, my friend. You can't hold back the dawn. You can't hold back the dawn. When we as Christians claim that Jesus Christ is alive, and He is, that doesn't mean that there's no darkness in the world. Darkness continues as it always has. It was a dark time when Hitler slaughtered 12 million Jews in the Holocaust. It was a dark time when Pearl Harbor was attacked. It was a dark time when we experienced 9/11. And I've walked with people who have gone through what I would call real dark moments. One of my pastor friends has recently moved back to Mississippi. He'd been down in Florida for about the last, I think, 10 years. And in the last year and a half, his oldest sister had COVID. back in 2020. Her husband was a doctor. He was taking care of her. He checked on her. She was fine. Next morning he went in to check on her. She was dead. His brother-in-law, who was that doctor, bought him a brand new 0-degree mower. And folks, if you don't know what you're doing on a zero, you can get hurt just like that, or you can be in a ditch just like that, or you can be in a pond just like that. He'd never been on a zero, and he flipped it over and killed himself. His father-in-law slipped on a deck out behind their house, bumped his head, and drowned. His other sister, about 2 months ago, was killed in a tragic head-on automobile accident out pretty close to the Cock of the Walk on the Natchez Traceway Parkway. And so he had experienced, one dark time after another dark time after another dark time, and he was down in Florida away from all of his family. And the Lord just worked it out where he could come back to Brookhaven, Mississippi, and pastor. And somebody asked me the other day, said, why in the world do you think he came back? And I said, well, I hope he came back because the Lord called him back. But I sure would understand after he's had just about all of his family taken away that he would want to get back close to where his family is located. I've stood by the graveside of loved ones. I remember when my mom passed away. I was preaching her funeral. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's one thing that I do at almost every funeral. Can I just say this? When we have I've never liked the closing of a casket in front of people. I just don't like that. I don't like it at all. And, if you have a visitation at a funeral home, you can dismiss, then they close. But when people are all in here, there's nothing else that you can. To me, that's just an awkward thing, and it hurts my heart. If you will notice, I will always stand right here until they close that thing. I'm staying with that person until that top is closed, and then I will go out and I'll pray with the family. Well, when my mom passed away, they took the family out, and I was standing by the casket. And the funeral director looked at me and said, don't you want to go be with your family? And I just simply said, I'm not leaving till you close this. I'm not leaving here until you close this. I've sat by the bed of good friends and loved ones and slowly watched them drift from this earth into the next. Hear about darkness every day. All you have to do is go online, type in Fox News, CNN News, CBS, NBC News, CBS News, and you'll find all these crazy stories. Have y'all been following the Alex Murdaugh trial? You know what he was guilty of, don't you? I actually watched the Nightline or Dateline like about 2 months ago on this situation where South Carolina lawyer was accused of murdering his wife and son. And I think it took them, 3 hours to convict him the other day? He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. I was watching the end of this the other night, and I just thought, how evil of a person do you have to be to murder your wife and your son, and they think that he did that to deflect the financial difficulties that he was having. And just think about the mindset it takes for somebody to do this. When the judge was pronouncing his sentence upon him, he said, you have said in this court you did not do this. But I believe the monster that you have become did this. You hear about child abuse on a regular basis. Trudy, while you were teaching, I'm not asking, did you ever have to report anybody? Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy. Jane, have you ever had to? You have. That's not easy, is it? That's a hard thing, and it's a hard, I've had to report because I'm a mandatory reporter. If I think that there's been any physical abuse or sexual abuse or anything like that, I don't have any other course but to call the authorities and report it. When we look and we see national leaders indicted for misappropriation of funds, I think that we're about the only one that don't have classified documents in our homes, aren't we? I mean, we had a former president, now we have a sitting president, a former vice president, and I'm sure about everybody else up there has classified documents in their home. And isn't it funny, when it's one side, it's wrong that the other side's doing it, right? But when the other side starts doing it too, well, you know, everybody does it. Everywhere you look, there's darkness. Alcoholism, drug addiction, AIDS epidemic, poverty. People seem to be unable to find the light. However, when you read John's gospel, we begin to see that darkness is not a new problem. Verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1, this is what John says. The darkness can never master the light. But that's only the light that Jesus brings. Jesus said, I am the what of the world? Light of the world. His light shines in the darkness. The darkness cannot comprehend it. John recognized the darkness of evil, ignorance, sin, and suffering. But he also contrasted light with darkness. And he says darkness can never overcome the light. The light that Christ shines in and through his people. So don't you give up. Don't you stop. Don't you think that it's futile. Do what's right. Being right and doing right doesn't always feel right. I said that 2 weeks ago. And to me, that was a big statement. Being right, doing right, doesn't all feel right, because the world says if it feels right, what? Do it. But being right and doing right doesn't always feel right. Over 2,000 years ago, there was a dark night, and the disciples had gathered in the upper room, and they were hiding. Why were the disciples hiding in the upper room? Now, more than likely, this is the same upper room where they had shared the Lord's Supper, where Jesus had washed their feet. It's not very far from the courtyard of Caiaphas. And I'm going to tell you, when we were there back in 2011, the thing about it is when you go to the Holy Land, you will hear every language known to man. Because it's like one of the number one tourist spots in the world, especially Jerusalem. I had somebody ask me today, said, is flying into Tel Aviv safe? I said, safer than flying into Jackson. Safer than flying into New York City. It's the safest airport in the world. You know why? They profile. They profile, and they do not care. And when 9/11 occurred, do you know we sent some of our top security people to Tel Aviv to see how to secure an airport? Because their airport, buddy, I'm telling you, it is secure. But these disciples are hiding in the upper room, which, like I said, is not very far from the courtyard of Caiaphas. Why were they hiding? Why were they so afraid? This is where you talk. Why were the disciples afraid? Why are they terrified? Why are they in this upper room? Okay, what? Right? They knew that Jesus had basically had been sentenced to death for what they were doing. Okay? Mm-hmm. Why do you think they went back to the upper room? Yeah. It was the last place that he had been with them. Probably familiar, probably still had the usage of that room because it's fresh off of the time when he took the towel in the basin. You know, we're talking probably less than 24 hours. They're afraid that what happened to Jesus is going to happen to them. So they were running. Remember, he said, a time is coming where you will flee and you will be like sheep without a shepherd. When you read your Bible and you're reading through the Gospels where Jesus is talking, just go through and see how many times it turned out just like he said it would. Every time. He wasn't right sometimes. He was right all the time. My sister-in-law, not my wife, my sister-in-law has a magnet on her refrigerator that said, when I married, I thought I married Mr. Right. I just didn't realize that his first name was Always. Jesus was always right. And let me just go ahead and give you a spoiler alert. When somebody looks at you and says, how can you prove the resurrection? What is your greatest proof that Jesus was raised from the dead? What is your response? The witnesses, okay? Come on. It's where y'all talk. He said he was going to, okay? Huh? The empty tomb. But you know, body could have been stolen. Women could have gone to the wrong tomb. You know how women are when they get to talking. He appeared to people, but that's just hearsay. That's inadmissible in a courtroom. Okay. Y'all are hitting close. Come on. Yeah, that's basically what Joe said. All right. When somebody gets into an argument with you as a Christian, say, well, how you know? Two things. Remember this name, Josephus. Josephus was a great Jewish historian. And Josephus never, ever refutes the resurrection. Ever. If it really didn't happen, that would have been something that he would have written about. That would have been something that he would have included in all of his writings. Okay. But the best litmus test of the resurrection is this. See these guys now? They're hiding. They're fearful. They're afraid for their lives. All of them, with the exception of John, were martyred for their belief. You think these guys would die for a lie? Something changed these sniveling, lack of a backbone disciples into flaming evangelists for the cause of Christ. And they kept on, and they kept on, and they kept on. And if you go to the book of Acts, when they are appearing before the Jewish leaders, Peter said, we cannot be silent. John, in one of his small epistles, said, that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which we have touched with our hands, we proclaim to you the word of truth. On Sunday, a group of women approached the tomb to anoint the body with the spices and which would have been for anybody's burial. And as they approached, they were wondering who was going to roll away this big stone in front of the tomb. Now, I have a picture, and I showed it to them on Wednesday night, of a tomb from those days. The rock is not like a round rock. Do you follow what I'm saying? We oftentimes, again, think of a round rock that's kind of placed in a hole. That's not the way it was. It was more like a giant wheel, probably about yay so wide. And it was rolled in front of the tomb and sealed that way. And it took 2 or 3 men to roll a stone and put it in place. And I think that we ought to ask a question today when we look at our world in which we live, who can roll the stone of darkness away that's kept us from authentic life? Jesus promised his followers a way to real life. He said, I am the door. He said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And he wants fellowship with his followers. Do you remember the story of the raising of Lazarus? Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's teaching there. He gets word that Lazarus is at the point of death. He delays his trip. He comes to Bethany several days after Lazarus had been placed in a tomb, and Martha meets him on the road. And I'm going to tell you, when you go to be with a grieving family, usually when they see the pastor, it's a warm welcome. It's a warm welcome. You know, you go in and they come up to you and put their arms around you. I was just thumbing through my Bible a few moments ago, and see if I can find it. Probably can. I can't ever find anything I want. Yeah. This card was given to me when I was in Canton. This is our visitor's card. That's how far back this goes. And this particular lady, I did her daddy's funeral. I did her mother's funeral. I did the wedding ceremony of her oldest daughter. I did the wedding ceremony of her son. I did the wedding ceremony of her youngest daughter. And I did her husband's funeral. And so whenever I show up at her house, I know what kind of greeting I'm going to get. She just said, throughout the years, I have found security in you, your friendship. How thankful I am. This never goes out of my Bible. If I change Bibles, it goes in it. Because it's one, reminds me of what I do. It reminds me of what I represent as well. It also reminds me of how people view me, some people. But not all people are like that. And Martha was one of those folks. She meets Jesus on the road, and she doesn't throw her arms around him, does she? What does she say? Remember? Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother would still be alive. I mean, that's not, there's no hello. How was your trip? Gosh, we're glad to see you. If you'd have been here, my brother would still be alive. Mary doesn't even come out. And do you remember what Jesus said to her? He said, your brother will rise again. Which to me kind of sounds like, happenstance or just a little cutesy-wootsy saying, he's in a better place. You know, he's with the angels now. Heaven just gained a new angel, which please don't ever say that. No indication we become angels. You weren't an angel on this earth, and you won't be an angel when you're out of this earth, okay? And Jesus said, your brother will rise again. And she said, I know he will rise again in the resurrection in the last days. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, yet shall he live. Do you believe this, Martha? And Martha responds with the highest affirmation ever recorded in Scripture. Thank you, ladies. Wasn't from a guy. It was from a woman. She said, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And do you remember he goes over to the tomb and he calls Lazarus to come forth. And when Lazarus comes out of the tomb, he's covered with all these burial cloths. And he says this, unbind him. Now, folks, let me tell you something. I think there's some things that he wants us to come unbound from. And one is unauthentic life. Jesus said this, I have come that you may have life. Life. Life here, life everlasting. Too many people miss it. They're looking for life in material things, and it will never give you the satisfaction nor the peace that Christ gives you. I heard a story years ago about a Texas millionaire. He wanted to be buried, Johnny, in his Cadillac. Didn't want to be buried in a regular coffin. He said, have you heard that song, Prop Me Up Beside the Jukebox When I Die? Okay, well, he didn't want to be propped up by the jukebox. He wanted to be behind the wheel of his Cadillac. And so when he dies, they put him in a suit and tie and strap him in, holding on to the steering wheel. People all over town come to see them bury that Cadillac, and it's not a 6-foot hole. I mean, it is a huge hole. You know how big a grave is? Several years ago, my dog passed away when I was in Clinton. We had to put her down while we were there. It was a very traumatic experience. It was on a Saturday on Valentine's. And we were driving back here, and I called Dale Brewer. I asked him about this sometime. I said, Dale, could you get Strip or one of your guys to dig a small hole? I said, Chesney passed away. And he goes, oh, man, I hate that. And I said, yeah, I need to bury her. He said, we'll get it taken care of. It was cold, and the ground was hard. And when I got there, Jerry, if you know where the shed is back there, I walked out there, and there was a 6-foot hole. A 6-foot hole. And I got on the phone, and I called Dale. I said, Dale, did you hear what I said? I said, my dog died, not my wife. And folks, I'm going to tell you, if you've ever tried to fill in a 6-foot hole, I put the little dog down in it and got a shovel and started, and people are starting to watch from the neighborhood. He's absolutely lost his mind. Who is he burying? The funny thing about it was my other dog, Jeter, was sitting on the back of this chair looking out and going, I ain't going outside. I ain't going outside. Chesney hadn't come back. But anyway, getting back to our story, they're burying this Cadillac in this huge hole, and everybody in town's watching this crane pick up this Cadillac, swing over to put it down in the dirt, down in that huge hole. And a stranger walks up, and he said, what's going on? And they told him. They said, that guy's so rich, he's being buried in a Cadillac? They said, yeah. He goes, man, that's living, ain't it? No. That is not living. That is dying. But here's the sad part. There are too many people that are walking around our world today that don't know that they're dead men walking. They are dead where they stand because they never experienced life. They're only a shadow of what Christ wants them to be. Do you know that there's nowhere in Scripture where Jesus said he wants you to be happy? He wants you to have joy, but not happiness. He hadn't said he wants to be unhappy, but look, he'd rather you be holy than happy. Because holiness leads to joy. Jesus also comes to roll the stone of human frailty away. We have a hard time admitting that we are mortal because death affects everybody but us. But your days are numbered. And you will die. The ladies didn't think they were strong enough to roll the stone away. Their limitations demonstrated their human frailty. We're not strong enough to do this. And I think there are times when you and I have to get to a point where we say, we can't do this. God, only you can do this. And there have been problems in my life that I have tried to solve, that I've tried to call, I've tried to influence, I've tried to manipulate, and I come back and I say, God, you got to do this. I can't carry this burden. I can't deal with this problem. You know something about your own human frailty. Our health is frail. Loved ones become sick. Marriages are pulled apart. There are those that are looking for strength in other directions other than the church, because the church is only for the weak who can't make it on their own. But the Apostle Paul came back in Philippians 4:13 and said what? Does anybody know that passage? I can do what? Okay, look at that passage for a moment, Philippians 4:13. Does he say I can do a couple of things? Did he say I can do a few things? You can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. But the flip side of that verse is, what can you do apart from Christ? Christ meets our own frailty with power, strength, and resources we've never known. How many of you have gone through a horrific situation, be it with your family or your business or even a church, and then 2 or 3 years later you get out of it and you look back and you say, that was God. Can't explain it. That was God. You didn't know it while you were in it, did you? It was hard to understand it when the darkness was consuming you. God hasn't told us, I'm going to remove you from the darkness. That's not what He said. He hadn't said, I'm going to remove you from the difficulties. That is not what He has said. He's not said, you're not going to have any pain. Tommy, how much did that hurt on when you hit your head on that toy box the other day? Didn't feel good. He's got the real pink eye back there because he's got stitches. But what He has done is He has told us that His presence will never leave us. He'll never leave us. We can hear His voice strengthening us and empowering us. He rolls the stone of indecency away with His presence. But 3, God also comes into our lives through Jesus, the risen Savior, and rolls back the stone of disbelief. I think we forget how difficult it was for the disciples to believe, which brings up this question. Is it easier to believe in Christ now, or was it easier to believe then? Easier to believe now, easier to believe then. Can I help you with something? They didn't have a New Testament back then until they started writing this down about 60 years later. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, it was a whole lot easier back then. You could have seen it. Many saw and still did not believe. Folks, you have the New Testament, you have church, you have discipleship, you have Bible study, you have some of the greatest biblical scholars who have ever walked this planet, you have heard some of the finest preachers, you have heard songs that convey the meaning of the resurrection and the power and the life that comes through walking with Christ. You about have to try to go to hell today. You really do. Because he's put so many barriers up to keep you out of hell. It's much easier to believe now than it ever has been. Because every day, you realize with just a click of a button, you could hear some of the greatest preachers ever. Tonight, you can go home. If you got an hour and about 10 minutes, you can listen to, in my opinion, the greatest sermon ever preached. R.G. Lee, Payday Someday. Preached it every year. Preached it every place that he went. Payday Someday. And I'm going to tell you, you listen to R.G. Lee preach, who was at Bellevue Baptist Church, and all my folks who love Adrian Rogers. Adrian Rogers was a fine preacher, but he couldn't carry R.G. Lee's Bible. They don't preach like that anymore. I had to dissect that sermon during my doctoral studies, and I just simply went, nobody preaches like this anymore. It's a lost art. You see, Jesus Christ enters our world of unbeliefs and changes our doubts, even when our faith is strong. And then, when our convictions are unsteady, we find forgiveness. Number 4, he rolls the stone of unforgiveness away. I think that a lot of us are held back from being what God wants us to be because of our past. Have you ever noticed when you start to do something for the Lord, you remember your past? I always tell people, make sure you're listening to the right voice. I've had people that have come to me that I've asked to teach Sunday school. Oh, I can't do that. And they'll sit in my office and say, can I tell you what happened to me 15 years ago? 15 years ago, I had an affair. Now, nobody else knew it, but, you know, my husband or my wife found out, and, you know, we rectified everything. I just can't do it. Now, look at me and say, so something that you did 15 years ago is going to keep you from serving God today. Don't have a higher standard of forgiveness than God has. Folks, I'm more concerned with where a person is today than where they were 20 years ago. Mark Twain said, I had a great future in my past. Don't we all? Everybody has done something. Everybody's got a past. Have you ever heard of barnacles? Larry, you ever heard of barnacles? Sea barnacles? I knew that you would. They're sea creatures, and they're about the size of a walnut, and they can attach themselves to ships. And together, listen to this, together they can add 100 tons of weight to one ship. They have to be removed with a jackhammer. And I can tell you, sometimes some of our past sins almost have to be removed with a jackhammer. Remember this. Again, Jane, I think this is in the song. God's more concerned with what? Direction headed than distance covered. Those things always stick out with me. He's more concerned with the direction you're headed, the distance that you covered. Number 5, the early disciples were trapped behind a door of cynicism and despair. I'll be off one. My outline's different than yours. I'm starting to look over here. They were wondering, where do we go? What are we going to do? Their world had literally come to an end because they had staked everything that they owned on this traveling rabbi. And I guess when the resurrected Lord appeared over that period of time of 40 days, where was Peter at that time? He'd already gone back to fishing. He'd already gone back to what he knew. Their lives were hopeless. But the resurrection changed everything. God rolled back the stone of death. When Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life, it didn't mean very much at the tomb of Lazarus, but it meant everything at the empty tomb, the garden tomb. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth and said, if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, our faith is futile. Paul said, if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, then our preaching is in vain. Paul said, if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, we are still in our sins. But today, for us as Christians, that's not the case, because he is alive. There are some here today that only see darkness. Death, depression, sin, and worldly living. That's all that we see. But John assures us that the darkness can never overcome the world. You know how I know that? You know what a God wink is? A God wink is something that happens in your life where you go, oh, okay, you're really up there. Let me give you one of my favorite God winks. Y'all know Joe McKeever, don't you? All right. Joe and I were having dinner in Decatur, Alabama. I had him over there to do a winter Bible conference, and we'd gone out to dinner, and we started talking about everybody that we knew in common. And the one that we knew the most, that he knew extremely well, and I knew extremely well, as actually was two of them. One of them was Argel Smith, who has preached here, and the other one was Dr. Frank Pollard, the late pastor at First Baptist Church in Jackson. And so Joe is talking about Dr. Pollard, and I said, yeah, he's one of my favorite people. And he said, you know, Argel Smith tells the story. Argel Smith tells the story of a student who went to interview Dr. Pollard one day for his doctoral work. And he asked Dr. Pollard, what would you like to be remembered by? And Dr. Pollard simply said, I don't want to be remembered. Only that I preached Christ and him crucified. And I looked at Joe McKeever and I said, do you know who that student was? And he said, nope. I said, that was me. And he said, do you know how many times I've told that story? And how long we've known each other? I said, yep. He said, I got it from Argel. I said, Argel got it from me, because I had to submit the paper to Argel. He was my professor. and you get something like that, and that's just God winking at you, saying, yeah, you see how I tie everything together? I'm making all things new. He gives us those little God winks. One of them was several years ago when everybody was taking a knee in NFL. There was one guy that was taking a knee in prayer. Tim Tebow. He gives us a God wink on Monday Night Football when a young man gets hit and goes into cardiac arrest and everybody's praying. Isn't it amazing? Like I said last week at the Grammy Awards, 5-minute time of worship to Satan. How long is this revival at Asbury going on? God said, watch this. You had your 5 minutes. We're into about our 6th week, and it's still going on. Don't you for one moment stop believing that he's got the whole world in his hands. He's still making all things new. And he's still bringing folks out of the darkness and into his light. Aren't you glad? I am certainly glad that he didn't give up on me. Well, this is it, folks. We won't have any more time together. This is the end of our semester. I appreciate it. We will pick back up probably in the fall. We'll have another study, and you'll get to pick what you would like to do. So, thank y'all for being here. Let me dismiss us with prayer. Father, dismiss us with your grace, your love, and peace as we go our separate ways tonight. And may we be good stewards of what you've entrusted us with. In your